Okay, let's go. Number 1. St. Leonard's Church. The air down here smells like chalk dust and cold stone. The kind of smell you only get in a room that hasn't had a window opened in it for the better part of 1,000 years. You're part of a research team called St. Lorg, the St. Leonard's Osteological Research Group, and you're deep into a 3-year project that started in 2008, examining every single skull in this crypt, one at a time, and writing down exactly what happened to the person it belonged to before they died. You're standing in a stone chamber underneath an ordinary parish church in a small English seaside town, and in front of you is a wall of more than 1,000 skulls, stacked 4 rows deep, sitting on top of a single continuous stack of thigh bones that runs 25 feet down the room. This crypt is supposed to hold nothing but the ordinary dead of Hythe. But one skull in the southwest bay punches a hole straight through that assumption. There's a hole clean through the bone, dead center, with fracture lines radiating outward from the point of impact like cracks spidering across a windshield. Something went through this person's skull with enough force to shatter the bone outward on the far side, and there's no sign of healing anywhere around the wound, which means it happened at or very near the actual moment of death, not years before it. For centuries, nobody could agree on what this crypt actually was. The first written mentions come from a local diarist named Samuel Jeek in 1678 and a clergyman named Brome the year after. And both were already describing bones that had clearly been down there a long time. Theories piled up over the following 3 centuries. Danish Vikings, killed in a raid on the coast. Casualties from the Battle of Hastings in 1066, dragged inland. Black Death victims, thrown in because the churchyard ran out of room. Each theory got tested against the bones themselves, and each one collapsed. Battle wounds don't cluster the way a plague pit does, and a raid or a single battle doesn't leave behind roughly equal numbers of the old, the young, and the sick, spread out over multiple centuries of tooth wear and healed fractures. A Viking raid doesn't leave behind a population that's mostly women and children either. Whatever filled this room filled it slowly, generation after generation of ordinary deaths and burials. When St. Lorg finished cataloging all 1,022 skulls on the shelves, the real answer turned out to be almost anticlimactic and far stranger at the same time. These aren't battle casualties or plague dead at all. They're ordinary long-term residents of Hythe, dug up out of the town's own churchyard, starting in the 13th century, when the church needed to expand and had nowhere else to put centuries of accumulated burials. The remains likely represent at least 4 separate graveyards, closed and cleared by 1500. Nearly 10% of the skeletons belong to children. Almost a quarter show cribra orbitalia, a pitting of the eye sockets that shows up in people who suffered chronic iron deficiency for years before they died. This is a town's entire population, generation after generation after generation of it, quietly relocated into one room so the living could keep using the ground above, a solution to overcrowding that predates any of the ossuaries later on this list by centuries. The skeletons show a higher ratio of women to men than you'd expect from a typical medieval population, along with widespread evidence of joint disease and dental wear consistent with people who lived hard, physical lives well into old age. In other words, this isn't a mystery about who these people were. Researchers can tell you a great deal about how they lived and how their bodies wore down over decades. The mystery is narrower and stranger than that. It's one specific head in one specific bay that doesn't match anybody else on the shelf, which makes that one skull, sitting quietly among 1,000 others in the southwest bay, even harder to explain. If everyone else down here died slowly, of anemia or old age or childhood illness, what happened to the one person with a hole punched clean through his head? Researchers have floated 2 explanations. Trepanning, a form of ancient skull surgery performed while the patient was still alive, or a blade, driven through with enough force to blow bone fragments outward on the far side. Trepanning itself isn't some exotic guess. People had been drilling and scraping holes into living human skulls since the Stone Age, usually to relieve pressure from a head injury, or, in plenty of documented cases, for reasons that look closer to ritual than medicine, and a striking number of trepanned patients across history show bone regrowth around the hole, meaning they survived the procedure and lived on for years afterward. If that's what happened here, this person went through actual, deliberate skull surgery, awake, with 13th century tools, and there's no way to know from the bone alone whether it saved his life or ended it. Nobody down here can tell you which. and nobody gets to just wander down and look for themselves either. The door to this crypt stays locked. You need a prearranged tour and the church warden's own key to get anywhere near that skull, and even then, you're looking at a piece of evidence that has sat under an active English parish church for the better part of a millennium, waiting for somebody to explain it. They still can't. That's one hole through one skull nobody can explain. Wait until you see what a Bohemian parish priest did with 3,000 of them, on purpose, in plain sight. Number 2. The Skull Chapel. The year is 1776. You're a Catholic parish priest named Vaclav Tomasic, and you've just come back from a pilgrimage to Rome, where you toured the Capuchin cemetery and watched monks build entire rooms out of the bones of their own dead. The Capuchin cemetery that inspired you sits underneath the Church of Santa Maria della Concezione in Rome, a different order and a different country from your own parish, and yet the idea traveled home with you anyway. Bones, arranged deliberately instead of buried and forgotten, could become their own kind of sermon. You're standing now in your own small parish in Chermna, on what was then the border between Bohemia and Silesia, and you're looking at a region that has spent 150 years quietly filling its soil with bodies nobody had time to bury properly. The 30 Years' War tore through here between 1618 and 1648, one of the deadliest conflicts in European history before the 20th century, the kind of war where entire villages disappeared and nobody came back to bury the dead properly. 3 separate Silesian wars followed in the 1740s and 1750s, fought over this exact stretch of border between Prussia and Austria. Cholera, plague, syphilis, and famine took whoever the wars didn't. For a century and a half, this ground had been swallowing the dead faster than anyone could account for them, and most of them went into the earth without so much as a wooden marker. So you decide to dig them back up. Working with a sacristan named Schmidt and a gravedigger named Langer, Tomasic spends the next 18 years collecting skeletal remains from the region's mass graves, battlefields, and plague pits, hauling them back by cart, cleaning them by hand, and building them, deliberately, one skull and one femur at a time, into the walls, ceiling, and floor of his own small chapel. 3 men did that entire job themselves, not a monastery's paid labor force, which is a large part of why it took nearly 2 decades to finish. By the time he's done in 1794, roughly 3,000 skulls stare out from every visible surface of the building, arranged in patterns, stacked in columns, crossed femurs, forming decorative borders around the doorways, set into the vaulted ceiling directly above the altar where the priest would have stood for Mass. And that's just what you can see, before you even look up. Beneath the chapel floor sits a crypt holding another 21,000 sets of remains, the overflow that couldn't fit on the walls, sealed under a trapdoor that stays closed to the public today. Here's the detail that turns this from an eccentric priest's obsession into something closer to a confession. In 1804, Tomasic had his own skull, along with the skulls of Schmidt and Langer, placed into the chapel he'd built, set at the very center of the altar, among the thousands of strangers whose bones he'd spent 18 years collecting. He didn't just build a monument to the region's dead. He made sure he'd be part of it forever. I mean, think about that for a second. A man spends nearly 2 decades personally excavating tens of thousands of corpses, most of them anonymous casualties of wars and plagues that happened before he was even born, and his final act is to have his own head added to the pile. Nobody assigned him that job. No bishop ordered it, and nothing in his vows required it. He'd spent 18 years hauling the bones of 24,000 dead strangers out of mass graves and battlefields, and when he finished, he had his own skull placed in with theirs anyway. Compare that to the other bone churches on this list, and Tomasic's project stands out for one specific reason. Almost everyone else on this list who built something like this was working with bones their institution had already accumulated slowly over centuries through ordinary deaths and burials. Tomasic went out and actively recovered his material from mass graves and battlefields that predated his own priesthood, on purpose, as a specific act of reclamation rather than routine maintenance. Nobody will ever put names to most of that 24,000. There was no census tracking who died where during the 30 Years' War in this specific stretch of the Bohemian border, no unit rosters for the Silesian conflicts that came a century later, and cholera doesn't keep guest lists. Tomasic had no record of individuals left to preserve. What he built instead was the plain physical fact that this many people existed and died in this one small region, permanently, in a form no record could ever really capture the same way. 3,000 actual skulls, set into a wall by hand, tend to make that point on their own. The chapel itself is open today, a genuine tourist stop in a small Polish spa town, visitors filing past the same skulls Tomasek arranged more than 2 centuries ago. But the crypt underneath, the room holding 21,000 of the roughly 24,000 people whose bones make up this building, isn't part of the tour. Nobody has ever produced a name-by-name accounting of who's actually down there. It sits sealed beneath the floor visitors walk on, unlit and unopened, holding 7 times more dead than the walls above it show you. A majority of this building's entire population kept permanently out of view, and Tomasek's approach to death, dig it up, put it on display, make it impossible to ignore, is the mild version of what was about to happen in Milan. Number 3. San Bernardino alle Ossa. The year is 1931. You're part of a restoration crew working inside one of Milan's strangest churches, a chapel already famous for having its walls decorated, floor to ceiling, in human bone, skulls set into niches like bricks, long bones stacked into columns and archways, an entire small sanctuary built out of the dead instead of hiding them underground. The ossuary here dates back to 1210, when a small chamber was built specifically to hold remains from an overcrowded cemetery attached to a hospital next door, one that had been treating Milan's sick and poor since 1145. Over 5 centuries, the bone supply never really stopped. When the hospital finally closed in 1652 and its old graveyards were cleared to make room for the city growing around them, those remains came here. So did bones from the nearby Brolo Hospital, from executed prisoners held in local jails after 1622, from aristocratic Milanese families who apparently wanted to be remembered this way, and from canons of the Basilica of Santo Stefano next door. Every social class Milan had, the sick, the poor, the criminal, and the wealthy, ended up filed into the same walls. That last group is the strange part. Aristocratic families didn't have to end up here. They could afford proper marble tombs anywhere in the city. Some of them chose this instead, chose to have their bones filed into a wall alongside executed prisoners and unclaimed hospital dead, which tells you that by a certain point, being part of this particular display had become its own kind of status. By the time Sebastiano Ricci finished frescoing the chapel's vault in 1695, this was already one of the most unusual buildings in the city, a working church whose walls happened to be built from several hundred years of the local dead. There's a legend attached to one specific niche, to the left of the altar, that locals still repeat today, even if nobody can trace it to a documented source. The story goes that the bones of a young girl rest in that spot, and that every year on November 2nd, All Souls' Day, her remains stir back to life and lead the rest of the skeletons in the walls through a kind of dance, a dance macabre playing out inside a building that's already made of nothing but the dead. There's no record proving any of that. It's exactly the kind of story a church built entirely from human remains was always going to generate, whether the builders intended it or not, and it stuck around for long enough that tour guides still repeat it as fact to visitors who never think to ask for a source. This wasn't some fringe, forgotten corner of the city either. Milan in this period was one of the wealthiest cities in northern Italy, and the hospital feeding this ossuary, the Coe Grande, eventually grew into the massive Ospedale Maggiore, a medical institution that operated for centuries and treated generation after generation of the same population, whose bones ended up decorating this chapel's walls. The people who built and used this ossuary weren't treating death as something shameful to hide in an unmarked pit outside the city walls. They put it on public display in the middle of one of Europe's major cities, dressed it in fresco and gold leaf, and kept using the space as an active place of worship for centuries afterward. But you're not here to admire Ricci's frescoes. You're here because the 1931 restoration has just found something nobody catalogued the first time around. A second crypt, hidden beneath the visible ossuary, packed with additional bones that had been sitting there, forgotten, since before anyone thought to write down what this building actually contained. Think about the timeline for a second. This chapel had already survived a fire in 1712 that destroyed the original structure. It had already been rebuilt by 1717 and had its facade finished in 1776. That's 2 full centuries of Milanese priests, restorers, guidebook writers, and curious visitors walking through this space, cataloging its bones, describing it as one of the city's must-see oddities, and every single one of them missed an entire additional room. Nobody was hiding it on purpose. It had simply been bricked over and forgotten long enough that the memory of it disappeared along with the door. A church built specifically to be a monument to its own dead had a chamber full of dead people that even the people running the monument didn't know about. Nobody has published a full public inventory of what exactly the 1931 crew cataloged down there, or how many additional individuals it holds beyond the estimates already attached to the visible ossuary above. That hidden crypt isn't part of the public tour today. The visible ossuary, the walls and niches you can walk past and photograph, is the version of this building the city lets you see. Whatever sits in the room the 1931 crew found stays exactly where it was found, sealed away in a building whose entire purpose is supposedly to put its dead on display, not hide them. If a church built specifically to put its bones on display still had bones it didn't know about, you have to wonder what else in this list is hiding something even its own caretakers never found. In Rome, the answer to that question was buried under a working church for nearly 750 years. Number 4. The Basilica of San Clemente. The year is 1857. Your father Joseph Maluli, an Irish Dominican prior in charge of an ordinary medieval basilica near the Colosseum, and you've decided to dig underneath your own church. Not for treasure. Out of curiosity about a few old columns and fragments scattered around the basilica that seemed too old, too finely carved, and too out of place for the plain 12th century building sitting on top of them. What you find, level after level, going down, is a church swallowing its own history, the way sediment swallows a fossil. The basilica you run was built around 1100, but directly beneath it, sealed under centuries of fill dirt and rubble, is an entire earlier basilica from the 4th century, complete with its own nave, side aisles, and a colonnaded entrance, abandoned and buried on purpose so the new church could be built on higher, more stable ground. That's the first shock. It's not the last. Beneath that 4th century church, your crew finds a structure from the 2nd and 3rd centuries that had been repurposed by followers of the god Mithras, a Roman mystery cult whose members worshipped underground, in secret, in rooms built to feel like caves. Mithraism was, for a while, one of Christianity's real competitors in the ancient world, a religion of secret initiations and shared ritual meals that spread through the Roman military and civil service at roughly the same time the early church was spreading through the same empire. Only initiated members were allowed to know what happened in these rooms. Membership meant working your way through a series of secret initiation grades, and the whole point of building these temples underground, in cramped stone rooms meant to feel like the cave where the god was said to have slain the bull, was to physically separate the initiated from everyone else. Now you're standing in the same darkness they built on purpose, looking at a stone altar carved with the god Mithras killing that bull, the cult's central image, still down here after everyone who once knelt in front of it is gone, and after the religion that eventually replaced it built directly on top, without ever finding this room. And beneath that Mithraeum, you find the remains of buildings destroyed in the fire that swept through Rome in 64 AD, the same fire emperor Nero was blamed for. One of those buildings was an ordinary Roman house, 3 stories tall with rooms cut into the earth below street level. The other was something official and monumental, likely connected to the imperial mint that historical records place in this exact part of the city during the 1st century, the actual government building where the coins of the empire that eventually crucified Christian martyrs by the thousand were once struck. So here's what was actually sitting underneath an active, functioning Catholic church for nearly 750 years without anyone above ground knowing it was there. A Roman house and a fragment of an imperial building burned in Nero's fire. A pagan temple to a secretive foreign god built directly on top of the ruins by people worshipping in the dark on purpose. A full Christian basilica from the 4th century, built on top of that temple once the old religion lost. And finally, the current basilica, built on top of all of it around 1100, when the builders needed higher ground and simply filled the older church in with rubble rather than tear it down. 4 buildings, 4 different religions and regimes, stacked directly on top of each other like sedimentary rock, and every layer below the visible one stayed completely sealed and forgotten until Maluli started digging in 1857. A later excavation between 1912 and 1914, run by Father Louis Nolan, went even deeper and confirmed the Nero-era fire damage at the very bottom. There's a strange upside to all that burial, though. The 4th century lower basilica still has traces of its original wall paintings, medieval frescoes that would likely have been worn away by 13 more centuries of Roman light, humidity, and foot traffic if the building had simply stayed in active use. Sealing it away, filling it with rubble, and forgetting about it for 750 years is very plausibly the only reason there was still paint left on those walls for Maluli to find in 1857. You can walk down into all of it today on a paid ticket, past the Mithraeum's altar, past the drainage channel the Romans built to keep the water table out, down through a chapel where 4th century Christians once worshipped directly above a rival religion's altar without ever knowing it was there, down to bedrock scorched by a fire 2,000 years old. What you can't do is know what that means about literally everything else built on top of something older in this city. If a Dominican prior could accidentally uncover a 1700-year-old secret cult temple just by getting curious about his own basement, the honest answer to what's underneath most of Rome is that nobody's fully sure, and most of it will stay that way until someone else gets curious enough to start digging. Every church on this list sits on some version of that same accumulated forgetting, a temple, a treasure, a decision, or a body that nobody wrote down at the time it happened. The only thing that changes from one sealed door to the next is who eventually got curious enough to look, and what was still there waiting when they did. What was hidden underneath the most important church on earth turned out to be the single most contested pile of bones in the history of the Catholic faith. Number 5, St. Peter's Basilica. World War II is tearing through Europe. Rome itself will be bombed before this is over, and inside the Vatican, workers are quietly digging beneath the largest church on earth on the direct orders of Pope Pius XII. He wants an answer to a question the Catholic Church has been unable to prove for 19 centuries. Is the Apostle Peter, the man Catholics consider the first pope, actually buried under his own basilica? Or is that just a story the institution has told itself since the 4th century? The dig runs from 1940 to 1949 in total secrecy, through the middle of a world war, directly beneath one of the most photographed buildings on the planet, while armies are fighting across the same continent and the same city just outside the Vatican's walls. Whatever this crew is about to uncover, they're uncovering it while the rest of Europe burns. And it finds something, deep under the current altar, working in cramped, ancient passageways lined with pagan and early Christian tombs on either side. The team uncovers a 2nd century monument, a small shrine built directly over what was already, even then, treated as a grave. Around it stands a wall covered in centuries of pilgrim graffiti, prayers and names scratched into plaster, by visitors who'd been coming to this exact spot since long before Constantine built the first basilica on top of it. Inside that wall, in a marble-lined compartment specifically built into the graffiti itself, the team finds human bones, wrapped, at some point in their long history, in a cloth woven with gold and purple thread, the kind of material reserved for people of real significance in the ancient world. And on the wall itself, one fragment of graffiti appears to read, roughly translated, "Peter is here." For nearly 20 years after the dig ended, nobody could agree on what any of it proved. Those particular bones were actually dismissed at first, filed away in storage for years because the original dig team didn't think they were connected to Peter at all. Then in the 1960s, an epigrapher named Margherita Garducci re-examined the graffiti wall and the bones inside it and proposed something specific. When Constantine's builders constructed the original basilica in the 4th century, she argued, they moved Peter's remains out of the original grave, which by then was empty, and sealed them into that marble-lined niche in the wall instead, to protect them while they built directly overhead. Garducci brought in Venerando Carenti, an anthropologist from the University of Palermo, to examine what was actually there, and his study concluded the bones belonged to a single man, powerfully built, somewhere between 60 and 70 years old at death. On June 26, 1968, Pope Paul VI stood in front of the world and announced that the relics of St. Peter had been identified in a way the Church considered convincing. Almost nobody outside a small circle of Vatican archaeologists gets to independently check any of it. Those bones aren't sitting in a museum case for public inspection. They're not available for outside researchers to run their own tests on whenever they want. Access to the necropolis itself, the actual ancient burial ground running beneath the basilica where all of this was found, requires booking a guided scavvy tour months in advance, capped at small groups, with children under 15 barred entirely, No photography allowed once you're inside, and a Vatican-trained guide walking you past the graffiti wall telling you exactly what you're looking at, rather than letting you draw your own conclusions from it. You are walking through the single most significant excavation in the history of Christianity, and the Church controls exactly how much of it you get to see, and exactly which conclusion you hear, stated as settled fact once you get there. The earth still clinging to those bones reportedly matched the composition of the soil at the original burial site beneath the shrine, which is part of what convinced Garducci she'd found the right remains. That's not an accusation that the Vatican is lying. Garducci's identification has held up as the Church's official position for more than 50 years now, and Paul VI never walked that statement back. But the disagreement over those bones didn't stay buried with the dig. Antonio Ferroa, the archaeologist Pius XII, originally put in charge of the excavation before Garducci's later analysis took center stage, spent the rest of his life disputing her conclusion. Two of the Vatican's own excavators, the two people who arguably knew this site better than anyone alive, never fully agreed on what they'd actually found, and that disagreement was never resolved before either of them died. Think about what that actually means. This isn't outside skeptics picking apart the Church's claim from a distance. This is a dispute that ran for decades between the two people the Vatican itself trusted to dig up the evidence in the first place. But it's also true that not every archaeologist who has studied the graffiti wall reads it exactly the way Garducci did, and the original grave itself, the spot tradition had pointed to for centuries before anyone dug, turned out to be empty when the team finally reached it. The bones everyone talks about were found some distance from where the original story said they'd be, tucked in a wall nearby, and identified only after the fact. It's worth sitting with the fact that the most important relic claim in an entire religion rests on one scholar's reading of broken plaster graffiti from a secret wartime dig, sealed inside a room most of the planet will never be allowed to walk into and check for themselves. If you're wondering how many other historic sites let outsiders get anywhere near their most important discovery, you already know the answer for most of the rest of this list. It's rarely as simple as a public plaque. This next one takes us from the most guarded bones in Christianity to the most famous ones on public display anywhere in the world. Let me say one thing, and I won't bring it up again. All 50 places like this one are now one book, The Sealed Vault. Yours to keep, easy to gift, and the best way to support this channel. Links below. Let's get back to the video. Number 6. Sedlec Ossuary. The year is 1278. You're the abbot of a Cistercian monastery in Sedlec, and you've just returned from a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, where you picked up a small amount of soil from Golgotha, the hill where Christians believe Jesus was crucified. You sprinkle that soil over your monastery's cemetery. Within a generation, word spreads across Central Europe that a burial here means a burial in genuinely holy ground, and nobles and commoners alike start having their bodies shipped to Sedlec from hundreds of miles away, just to end up in that dirt. Then the 14th century happens. The Black Death sweeps through, and the Hussite Wars follow it in the early 15th century, and Sedlec Cemetery, already popular, is suddenly the final resting place for tens of thousands of additional bodies with nowhere else to go. Around 1400, the monastery builds a Gothic chapel specifically to function as an ossuary, a place to consolidate the overflow. After 1511, a half-blind monk is given the job of exhuming and stacking the older bones to make room. For centuries, that's all this room is, a functional, half-forgotten bone store, doing exactly what it needs to do, and nothing more, visited by almost nobody except the monk responsible for stacking whatever came in next. The Cistercian order that ran this monastery was known across Europe for austere, unadorned architecture, plain stone, minimal decoration, nothing meant to distract from prayer. For 4 centuries, that's exactly what this room was too. Just storage, dark, unadorned, doing the one job an overcrowded medieval cemetery needed done. Nobody planned for it to become one of the most ornate, most photographed interiors in the entire country. That only happened because a wealthy family, more than 500 years after the first bone went into the ground here, decided a room full of the anonymous dead needed a craftsman instead of a broom. Then in 1870, the family that owns the estate hires a local woodcarver named František Rint and gives him a single job. Do something with all of this. What Rint builds is one of the strangest objects in European religious art, a chandelier hanging from the chapel's center, built from at least one example of every single bone in the human body, wired and stacked into a shape that, from a distance, looks almost like an ordinary church fixture, until you're standing close enough to see it's made entirely of people. Garlands of skulls drape from the ceiling like party decorations. 4 bell-shaped mounds of bones rise in the corners of the chapel, skulls arranged in tiers like a display case. Bone monstrances stand near the altar. A full coat of arms belonging to the Schwarzenberg family, the estate's owners, is rendered entirely in human bone, skull and femur standing in for the family's actual heraldic crest, right down to a raven perched on a severed head, referencing a real Schwarzenberg military victory, recreated here using the actual skulls of anonymous strangers instead of paint or stone. Rint even signs his work in bone, near the entrance, his own name spelled out in the same material as everything around it, a craftsman putting his signature on a canvas made of tens of thousands of people who never agreed to be art. Nobody has ever produced an exact head count, and researchers today still argue over the real total. Modern estimates put the total number of skeletons used somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 people. That's not a typo, by the way. Somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 individual human beings, most of them plague and war dead, with no names attached anymore. Reassembled by one 19th century craftsman into chandeliers and coats of arms for a wealthy family's private chapel. You'd think a building holding that many people would be treated with total reverence and left completely alone. Instead, it's one of the most visited tourist sites in the Czech Republic, photographed by millions of people a year. Its bone chandelier turned into a genuine piece of pop culture, printed on postcards and mugs in the gift shop, a short walk from the ossuary door. The whole complex has carried UNESCO World Heritage status since 1995, folded into the listing for the Historic Center of Kutna Hora, which means an international heritage body now has a formal say in how a room built entirely out of the anonymous dead gets preserved going forward. The building survived the Hussite Wars, 2 world wars, and decades of communist rule intact. What it hasn't survived intact is the idea that a monument built from tens of thousands of anonymous dead should stay quiet and undisturbed. It's the opposite of quiet. It's one of the most photographed interiors on the entire continent, and almost none of the people taking those photos could tell you a single name that belongs to a single bone in the room. If you're the kind of person who wants to know what's sealed behind the next 4 doors on this list, hit subscribe, because the next one flips the whole sealed for centuries idea completely. This next seal actually got lifted, on the record, in 2016. And that contrast, a room full of the genuinely forgotten dead, turned into one of the world's most photographed churches, is nothing next to what happened when researchers finally got permission to touch the actual tomb Christianity is built around. Number 7. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The year is 2016. You're part of a restoration team led by Professor Antonia Moropoulou of the National Technical University of Athens, working alongside National Geographic's Frederick Hebert, and you've just been given permission to lift the marble slab covering the stone shelf where Christian tradition says the body of Jesus was laid after the crucifixion, something no living person has ever legally done before. Getting permission at all was its own small miracle. 6 different Christian denominations, Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, Syriac Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, and Ethiopian Orthodox, jointly control this building under an arrangement called the status quo, first written into Ottoman law in 1757 and reaffirmed in 1852, and it requires every single one of them to agree before anyone moves, repairs, or alters anything inside. The arrangement is so rigid that a wooden ladder, propped against a window ledge above the entrance since at least 1728, has never been taken down, because moving it would require a unanimous vote nobody has ever managed to secure. It's called the immovable ladder, and Pope Paul VI once described it as a visible symbol of Christian division. For 6 denominations that couldn't agree to remove a ladder for close to 3 centuries, to unanimously agree to open Christ's tomb itself tells you how serious the structural danger had actually become. That slab has been sitting in place, sealed over the original rock, since at least 1555, and quite possibly for centuries before that. Nobody currently alive had ever seen what was directly underneath it. When your team finally lifts it, you don't find an empty cavity or bare bedrock. You find far more fill material stacked beneath the marble than anyone on the team expected, and underneath all of that, a gray-beige limestone surface, believed to be the original burial shelf itself. The actual rock a body would have been laid on in a tomb carved into a hillside outside Jerusalem's walls sometime around 30 to 33 AD. What makes this stranger than just old rock confirmed is the tradition itself. Every religious tradition surrounding this site, going back to the 4th century when the first church was built here, describes exactly this shelf, in exactly this location, under exactly this structure. For nearly 1700 years, people venerated a specific slab of stone inside an increasingly ornate building constructed around it, without a single living witness ever getting the chance to verify what was physically underneath the marble covering it. The tradition was either remarkably accurate for 17 centuries or remarkably lucky. The 2016 team's own conclusion, based on the mortar and the layers they found, is that this shelf is consistent with having been carved and enclosed in the exact era the tradition claims. And the danger was real. The small shrine enclosing the tomb, known as the edicule, had been quietly falling apart since a fire damaged its exterior in 1808. By 1947, the limestone cladding was unstable enough that British Mandate authorities had to wrap the entire structure in an exterior cage of iron girders just to keep it from collapsing, a temporary emergency fix that nobody replaced for the next 70 years. By 2016, Israeli authorities had declared the shrine unsafe outright, which is the kind of pressure that finally gets 6 historically feuding denominations to sign off on the same project. The restoration was funded partly by Jordan's King Abdullah II and partly by a $1.3 million gift from Micah Erdogan through the World Monuments Fund, ran from May 2016 through March 2017, and cost around $4 million. Once the work was done, the iron cage came off for the first time in 70 years, and the slab went back down, resealed under new marble reinforced to last considerably longer than the previous 500 years did. If you visit today, you're looking at the same covered slab pilgrims have knelt in front of for centuries. You're just looking at it knowing, for the first time in generations, what's actually underneath. That's a 500-year seal, opened once, briefly, by scientists with permits and a restoration deadline, then closed right back up. Not every sealed church on this list got resealed so gently. In Dublin, the reason a crypt is sealed today has nothing to do with careful restoration, and everything to do with a crime. Number 8, St. Michan's Church. You're a member of the clergy at St. Michan's, and it's a Monday morning in February 2019, and you're about to open the church to visitors the way you have almost every week for decades. Because this building sits on top of a set of vaults where something strange happens to the dead. The limestone walls down here stay naturally dry. Methane gas, left over from the swampland this part of Dublin was built on, seeps through the stone. The temperature barely moves year-round. Between all 3 of those conditions, bodies placed in these vaults don't decompose the normal way. They mummify on their own, with no embalming and no chemicals, inside plain wooden coffins that have simply rotted open over the centuries. The vaults hold several of these naturally preserved bodies, each with its own nickname. The Crusader, roughly 800 years old, exceptionally tall for a medieval man at around 6.5 feet, his legs broken and folded just to fit him into his coffin, one hand still stretched slightly out of the wood. The Nun, a small woman whose real identity nobody knows. The Thief, missing both feet and one hand. The vaults also hold plain, undecorated coffins belonging to the Shear brothers, 2 Irish revolutionaries executed by the British after the 1798 Rising, resting in the same rooms as bodies that predate them by 6 centuries. For nearly 3 decades, visitors could walk right up to the mummies, and for a modest entry fee, even shake the Crusaders' outstretched hand for luck, a small ritual generations of Dubliners and tourists genuinely took part in, treating an 800-year-old corpse like a good luck charm on the way out of church. But when you unlock the doors that Monday morning, you find the vaults have been broken into overnight. The Crusader's head has been severed and stolen outright. The mummified nun has been spun 180 degrees inside her coffin. A third body has been shoved onto its side. The steel door protecting the Hamilton family crypt, one of the sturdiest barriers in the entire building, has been forced open anyway, and a coffin inside it has been broken apart, its contents dragged out onto the floor for no reason anyone could later explain. Archdeacon David Pierpoint calls it sacrilegious and distressing, and the vaults close indefinitely. Roughly 28,000 visitors a year suddenly have nowhere to go. The crypts eventually reopen. Then in June of 2024, someone gets back in and deliberately sets a fire inside the vault itself. This time there's no theft to investigate, no head to search for. The fire destroys the Crusader completely, along with 4 more mummified remains, roughly 400 years old, that had survived on those shelves since before most of modern Dublin was built. Firefighters flood the space to put it out, leaving the vault under about a foot of standing water while Ireland's Garda Technical Bureau seals the scene for forensic examination. A man is arrested and charged under the Criminal Damage Act. Archdeacon Pierpoint, asked what happens next, says simply that the parish depends on tourist income from these crypts, and right now, there's very little left to show anyone. Dr. Michael Jackson, a senior figure in the Church of Ireland, called the loss irreversible, saying it would sadden generations of Dubliners and visiting school children who'd never get the chance the rest of us already had. An 800-year-old body survived plague, famine, war, and 8 centuries underground, and then it took one person with a lighter, in 2024, inside a locked church in a modern European capital, in about the time it takes to watch this video, to finish it off. The vaults sit sealed right now for a plain, modern reason. There's very little left down there for the church to safeguard. There's one more detail about this church worth knowing, and it has nothing to do with the crypt. St. Michan's has an old pipe organ that, according to long-standing Dublin legend, George Frederick Handel practiced on in the run-up to the world premiere of his Messiah, performed just across the river in April 1742. Nobody can fully document that Handel actually sat down at this specific instrument, but the organ is real, it still works, and generations of Dubliners have repeated the story anyway, the same way a whole city built a tradition around shaking a mummy's hand without asking too many questions about whether either story could be proven. Not every threat to a sealed church comes from someone breaking in, and not every seal on this list needed a lock, a door, or a vandal to hold. In Scotland, there's a vault that has stayed hidden for a completely different reason, one that has nothing to do with fires, thieves, or curses. Nobody alive actually knows where it is. Number 9. Rosslyn Chapel. Rosslyn Chapel was founded in 1446 by William Sinclair, and from the moment it was finished, it was covered, wall to ceiling, in some of the densest and strangest carving found in any European chapel: green men, biblical scenes, hundreds of individual botanical carvings, and one master-crafted spiral column known as the apprentice pillar, which local legend says was carved by a young apprentice while the master mason was away, and finished so beautifully that the master killed him out of jealousy on his return. Nobody can verify that story either. What's actually documented is stranger in a quieter way. The chapel's carvings include plant forms that some researchers have claimed resemble New World species like maize and aloe, plants Europeans supposedly didn't encounter until Columbus reached the Americas decades after the chapel was built. Mainstream botanists and historians largely reject that reading of the carvings. But the claim alone tells you something about this building. It's a place where even the stonework gets accused of hiding something impossible. The year is 1837. You're a mason working for the Sinclair family, and the second Earl of Rosslyn has just died with one specific request. Bury him in the chapel's original vault, the same underground chamber where earlier generations of Sinclairs were reportedly laid to rest fully dressed in their armor, without coffins, in a tradition nobody outside the family fully understood. There's just one problem. Nobody currently alive knows where the entrance to that vault actually is. You and the rest of the crew spend a full week searching. You check the obvious places, the floor, the crypt everyone already knows about, the walls around where family tradition says the old vault should sit. You find nothing. No door, no stairway, no seam in the stone that shouldn't be there. The Earl gets buried somewhere else, and the original vault, whatever it actually contains, stays exactly where it's been for centuries, completely inaccessible, its location known to nobody currently living. A full week of searching, by people who actually wanted to find it, who had every reason to open that vault and lay their own Earl to rest inside it, and they still came up with nothing. That failure to find it is the one hard documented fact underneath everything Rosslyn Chapel has become famous for since. Because once a chapel has a vault nobody can locate, people fill the silence with whatever story serves them best. Over the following century and a half, that empty space got credited with holding the mummified head of Christ, the Holy Grail itself. Treasure smuggled out of the Knights Templars' collapse in the 14th century. Even Scotland's original crown jewels. Medieval historians are blunt about all of it. there's no documented basis for any of those claims. The Templar connection specifically only shows up in print starting in the 1980s, decades before Dan Brown turned it into a global bestseller with the Da Vinci Code in 2003. Historians who have gone through the Sinclair family's own records point out the obvious problem with the Templar theory. Testifying against the order in open court, while the rest of Europe was busy dismantling it, put the Sinclairs on the historical record as willing participants in shutting the Templars down, a strange move for a family supposedly guarding the order's lost treasure. None of that stopped the Da Vinci Code from turning this small parish chapel into one of the most visited religious sites in Scotland almost overnight, tour buses arriving daily for a novel's fictional version of a building that had stood quietly for 5.5 centuries before anyone thought to connect it to a secret bloodline. More recently, researchers using ground scanning technology have claimed to pick up signs of a stairway or void beneath the chapel's floor, though as of now, no excavation has gone in to confirm what, if anything, is really down there, and that claim hasn't been independently verified. The vault could hold nothing but a handful of unmarked Sinclair burials from 4 centuries ago, knights buried the way family tradition describes, in full armor, with no coffin and no headstone to mark exactly where. It could hold something nobody's guessed yet. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and the one thing every legend about this place has in common is that none of them can prove they're describing anything real. A chapel can survive the Reformation, the Civil War, and 4 centuries of treasure hunters, and still keep one room nobody has ever actually walked into. Most of the other churches on this list eventually gave something up under enough digging or scanning or scholarship: a skull, a graffiti wall, a limestone shelf, a hidden crypt. Rosslyn hasn't, not once, not to a single search mounted against it in nearly 200 years, and that streak of nothing is a big part of why people keep showing up at its door. Which brings us to the last church on this list, the one where the mystery you've probably already heard turns out to have an actual paper trail, and that paper trail leads somewhere nobody expects. Number 10. Rennes-le-Château. The year is 1885. Your Béranger Saunière, a 33-year-old priest just appointed to a tiny, impoverished parish in the French Pyrenees, a village so small and so broke that your own church is falling apart around you. 2 years later, in 1887, you begin renovating it, starting small, with new flooring. Over the next decade, those renovations grow into something nobody in a village this poor should have been able to afford: new stained glass, an elaborately redecorated altar, and eventually 2 lavish personal properties, a house and a tower, built between 1898 and 1905. The math doesn't work. A parish this size generates nowhere near the money required, and yet by the time Saunière dies in 1917, he spent tens of thousands of francs on construction most bishops of the era would have struggled to justify. That gap between what a poor country priest should have had and what he actually built is real, documented, and undisputed. What happened next, the story built to explain it, is where this stops being history and starts being fiction dressed up as history. Here's the part almost every version of this story gets backwards. The famous legend, the one you've probably heard, says Saunière found ancient parchments hidden inside a hollow altar pillar during his renovations, documents hinting at treasure connected to medieval French royalty, and that this discovery is what funded his sudden wealth. That story did not come from Saunière. It did not come from anyone who knew him. It was invented in the mid-1950s, nearly 40 years after his death, by a restaurant owner named Noel Corbu, who had bought Saunière's old estate and needed a story that would bring in paying tourists. It worked, spectacularly, permanently, in ways Corbu himself probably never expected. A village that had a few hundred residents, and no reason for anyone to visit now, sees a steady stream of treasure hunters, novelists, documentary crews, and curious tourists arriving every year, decades after the original con was already public record. Corbu's version got picked up, expanded, and eventually merged with an entirely separate hoax, a fabricated organization called the Priory of Sion, invented from nothing by a man named Pierre Plantard. Plantard and his collaborators forged a set of documents known as the Dossier's Secrets, planted them in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, where any researcher could find and cite them, and built an elaborate paper trail specifically designed to make his invention look centuries old to anyone who came looking. That fabricated mythology is the direct ancestor of the Da Vinci Code, a novel built on a hoax, built on top of a real but far more mundane crime. So where did Saunier's money actually come from? Church records point to something far less romantic than a hidden treasure. Saunier had been running what's known as mass trafficking, accepting payment for thousands of Catholic masses he never actually performed, at roughly 1 franc each. It's religious fraud at scale, quiet enough that it took years for the church to act on it, and it explains the money without a single parchment or hollow pillar required. When Saunier died in 1917, his own bishop had already suspended him over those financial irregularities, a suspension only lifted at the literal last moment during his final rites. What that means for everything you've heard about this place is simple. The mystery is real. A poor priest genuinely got rich in a way nobody can fully account for through honest means. But the specific explanation that turned this into a worldwide phenomenon, hidden parchments, secret bloodlines, a centuries-old brotherhood guarding a holy secret, all of it was manufactured after the fact by people who had something to sell. The actual documented answer is a small-time con run by a lonely village priest. And somehow that answer is less comforting than the myth, because it means the story you already believed about this church was built by liars who showed up decades after the real, much smaller crime had already happened. 10 churches. 10 things sealed behind a door, a wall, a floor, or a story. Most of what's behind those seals turned out to be exactly as real and exactly as disturbing as the legend built on top of it. A skull nobody can explain, 12 feet under an English parish that still requires a key to visit. A crypt full of bones a restoration crew never expected to find, walled up again in Milan. A pagan temple buried under a working church for 750 years, and a set of mummies that survived 8 centuries only to be destroyed by an actual arsonist in living memory. The most contested bones in Christianity, guarded behind a booking system most of the planet will never use. A chandelier built from tens of thousands of anonymous plague and war dead, still hanging in Bohemia. A vault in Scotland that an entire search crew couldn't even locate in a full week of looking. One of these seals, though, hid something else entirely. No body, no temple, no tomb, just a poor man's fraud, repackaged decades later by strangers who needed a better story than the true one, and sold so successfully that it's still bringing tourists to a hillside in the Pyrenees today. That's the pattern worth sitting with. Most of what gets sealed away turns out to be real, verifiable, and stranger than the rumor built on top of it. A pierced skull is real. A hidden crypt is real. A secret pagan temple, a disputed apostle's bones, a 500-year-old marble slab, an arsonist destroying something that survived the Black Death, a vault nobody's ever located. All of it checks out every time someone actually goes and looks, and none of those 9 stories needed a novelist's help to be worth telling. But every so often, the seal isn't protecting a secret at all. It's protecting the people who profit from you never checking. Rennes-le-Château didn't need a hollow pillar or a hidden parchment to be interesting. It needed one, because the real story, a small-time con by a lonely village priest, was never going to sell postcards on its own. It took an osteologist, a restoration crew, a Dominican prior with an idle afternoon, a wartime dig, and one deliberate arsonist to force 9 of these churches to give something up. The 10th one, sitting quietly on a Scottish hillside, still hasn't blinked. If you enjoyed the video, give a like and tell where are you watching from. Subscribe for more.